The betting pool at the trading post had a new page before Daniel Reyes even finished unloading his crates. Bran Keswick started it himself, chalk in hand, writing a single question at the top of the board. How many days will the human last? Under it he wrote the number 7, his own guess, and grinned at the small crowd of Rel gathered around him. Nobody argued with him. Everyone on Vera Hollow knew the plot of land Daniel had bought, the cheapest one on the whole listing, the one that ran right up against the tree line of the deep green. Daniel did not hear any of this. He was too busy carrying his crates from the landing pad to the edge of the forest, one at a time, on his own back. He had turned down the loader drones offered to him at the port, and he turned down the land-clearing crew that Sela Avran, the colony administrator, tried twice to send his way. He said he would clear the land himself. Sela had stood on his new plot with her arms crossed, feathers along her neck raised in polite disbelief, and told him plainly that nobody built this close to the trees. Not anymore. Not since the last 3 families who tried it were never seen again. Daniel had only nodded and said he understood the risk. Then he had picked up his axe and gone to work, but not in the way anyone expected. He walked the tree line first, slow and quiet, looking at the trunks the way a man looks at strangers he is about to ask a favor from. When he finally raised his axe against a leaning, half-dead tree at the very edge of his plot, he said something under his breath before the first swing. Nima, the young forest warden trainee who had followed him out of curiosity, was close enough to hear it. He asked the tree for permission. She did not tell anyone at first, mostly because she was not sure what to make of it. Rel children were taught from birth that the deep green was not a place you spoke to. It was a place you avoided. The forest took land, took equipment, took people, and it never explained itself and never negotiated. Every colony on Vera Hollow kept a wide strip of cleared, dead ground between its buildings and the true tree line, a buffer nobody crossed without good reason and a fast vehicle. Daniel's cabin, if he ever finished it, would sit inside that supposedly forbidden strip, closer to the trees than any human or Rel structure in 20 years. By the end of the first week, the cabin had walls. Simple ones, made of the very timber Daniel had cut, dried, and shaped by hand. With a stone chimney he built himself from rocks he carried up from the creek bed. He worked from sunrise until the light failed, stopping only to eat and to walk the tree line again each evening, always in that same slow, watching way. The colony sent someone out most days, not to help, but to look. Word had spread fast. By the 5th day, half the trading post had made a bet on the board, and Bran was doing brisk business selling drinks to people who wanted to watch the disaster happen from a safe distance. Nothing happened. That was the strange part nobody could quite explain, and the reason the betting pool kept growing instead of paying out. The forest did not so much as touch Daniel's cabin. No creeping vine reached for the new roof. No root cracked the stone foundation in the night. When a storm rolled through on the 8th day and knocked a heavy branch down near the old survey post 2 kilometers south, tearing straight through its reinforced wall, Daniel's cabin sat in the open with only a light scattering of leaves on its roof, as if the wind itself had chosen to be gentle with that one small patch of ground. Sela came out personally on the 10th day, half expecting to find nothing left but an empty clearing and a missing person report to file. Instead, she found Daniel sitting on a half-finished porch, drinking something hot from a battered metal cup, looking entirely unbothered. She asked him, not for the first time, if he understood what he had built his home next to. He said he did. She asked him why he was not afraid. He thought about the question for a moment before answering that fear had never done him much good in a forest, back on his own world, and that the trees here did not feel any different to him than the ones he grew up walking through, except that these ones seemed to be listening. Sela did not know what to say to that. She looked past him at the tree line, at the dark, silent wall of trunks that had swallowed careless colonists whole within a season, and for the first time in her long service as administrator, she felt something other than fear looking back at her from the shadows between the trees. Not hostility, something closer to attention. She left without finishing her warning. Behind her, Bran Keswick was already erasing the number 7 from the betting board and writing a new, higher one in its place, muttering that the human was either the luckiest fool on the planet or something the deep green had decided it wanted to keep. Nobody in the colony was ready to guess which one was true. But as the days turned into weeks and Daniel's small cabin stood untouched at the very edge of the forest that took everything else, the question on everyone's mind quietly changed. It was no longer about how many days he would last. It was about what the forest thought he was. A month into Daniel's stay, Nima started keeping a private notebook, and she did not tell anyone about it, not even her own teacher. It began as a simple habit, a way to record the strange things she saw whenever she found an excuse to visit the tree line near his cabin. By the fourth week, the notebook had filled half its pages, and none of what she had written made sense next to anything she had ever been taught about the deep green. The first entry was about the deer trail. A well-worn path used by the local grazing herds ran straight across Daniel's land before he arrived, cutting through where his cabin now stood. Nima had expected the herds to keep walking through the humans' yard out of pure habit, the way animals always did, indifferent to fences and walls until something stopped them by force. Instead, within days of the cabin's walls going up, the trail had shifted. It now bent gently around the cleared yard in a wide loop, as if the ground itself had nudged the animals a different way. She checked the soil for signs of a fence or a barrier. There was none. The trail had simply moved, the way a river moves when something upstream changes its course. The second entry was about the beam. Daniel had been careless only once, setting a support post for his porch roof a hand's width past the line he had marked for himself as the edge of what belonged to him and what belonged to the forest. He noticed his mistake the next morning and meant to fix it himself, but when he walked out to the post, the roots beneath it had already loosened their grip and pulled back, leaving the beam sitting slightly crooked in soft, undisturbed soil, as if the forest had simply stepped out of its way overnight rather than fighting him for it. Daniel reset the post an inch further back and never made the same mistake again. Nima wrote 3 question marks after that entry and underlined them twice. She was not the only one starting to notice. Sela visited more often now, though she never admitted that her visits had shifted from official warnings to something closer to curiosity. She watched Daniel work through the 5th week, splitting logs, tending a small garden he had planted along the tree line using seeds he had brought from off-world, careful never to plant anything closer than a full arm's length from the nearest root. He never asked the forest for anything twice in one day. He never took more wood than he needed for that week's work. Even when a storm-felled tree lay ready and waiting, far more timber than his small cabin would ever require. Sela asked him once why he left the rest of it lying there to rot. He told her it was not his to take just because it was convenient, and that leaving it would feed something else in the ground eventually. He said this the way another man might comment on the weather, with no idea that the words themselves sounded like they had come from an old forest warden's oath. Bran Keswick, for his part, had lost more money on the betting pool than he liked to admit, and he coped with this the way he coped with most disappointments, by turning it into a story he could tell at the trading post. He started calling Daniel the man the trees forgot to eat, which got a laugh from the regulars, but stopped being funny to Bran himself the day he decided to see the cabin for himself, uninvited, hoping to catch some evidence that the whole thing was a trick. He walked the last stretch of road toward Daniel's land with his usual loud confidence, only to find it draining out of him the closer he got to the tree line. The forest here felt different from any patch of the deep green he had ever stood near. Not welcoming exactly. Watchful. Like walking into a room where everyone had gone quiet the moment he entered. He found Daniel repairing a section of fence around his garden, using nothing but hand tools and rope. Bran asked him outright if he had made some kind of deal with the trees, half joking, half genuinely hoping for a real answer. Daniel said he had not made any deal with anyone. He said he simply tried not to take more than he gave, and tried to remember that he was a guest here, not an owner. Bran laughed at that, called it a nice sentiment for a man standing on the one plot of land that should have killed him weeks ago, and left without an explanation that satisfied him. But something about the visit stayed with Bran longer than he expected. That evening, back at the trading post, he found himself quietly moving his own bet on the board from a low number to a much higher one, and when a newer settler asked him why, he did not have a joke ready for once. He only said that whatever was happening out at that cabin, it was not luck, and it was not a trick, and the sooner the colony figured out what it actually was, the better off everyone would be. Nobody at the trading post argued with him that night. Out past the buffer strip, in the deep quiet beneath the oldest trees on Vera Hollow, Something ancient had already begun paying very close attention to the small human cabin standing at its border, though not one person in the colony yet understood why. The survey ship landed on a Tuesday, and it landed hard, the way ships do when the people flying them care more about speed than the ground they are dropping onto. It belonged to an off-world resource company that had bought mineral rights beneath half the deep green through a paperwork loophole nobody on Vera Hollow had noticed until the machines were already on the ground. The company's lead surveyor stepped off the ramp wearing a suit built for 3 different climates at once and announced, loud enough for the nearest colonists to hear, that his crew would be cutting a transport corridor straight through the forest within the week, local superstitions or not. Sela met him at the edge of town within the hour, and the meeting did not go well. She explained, as calmly as she could manage, that the buffer strip around the deep green existed for a reason, that entire survey teams had vanished attempting exactly what he was proposing, and that no permit issued from an office 3-star systems away changed what waited in those trees. The surveyor listened with the polite, unmoved expression of a man who had heard local warnings on a dozen worlds and outlived every one of them. He told her his company had insurance for exactly this kind of risk, and that insurance, unlike fear, was something he actually trusted. Word reached Daniel's cabin by evening, carried by Nima, who had run most of the way from town without stopping to catch her breath properly before she started talking. She told him about the heavy clearing machines already being unloaded near the western tree line, about the corridor route marked out on a projected map that cut directly through the oldest, deepest part of the forest, land that even the most reckless Rel hunters refused to enter. Daniel listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he only asked how far the western tree line was from where they stood. She told him. He said nothing more that night, but he did not sleep well, and Nima noticed the way he kept glancing toward the dark tree line long after the fire had burned low. The clearing crew began work at first light. Heavy machines with rotating blades chewed into the outer trees, and for a few hours it looked as though the surveyor's confidence had been earned. The forest gave no visible response beyond the ordinary sounds of birds scattering and small animals fleeing the noise. Bran Keswick, watching from a safe hilltop with half the trading post crowd around him, muttered that maybe the old stories had finally run out of truth. He did not get to finish the thought. It started with the ground. Workers operating the heaviest machine near the corridor's planned center felt the earth shift beneath their treads, not violently at first, just enough to throw off a cut and jam a blade. Then the roots came, not from below in a single dramatic strike, but from every direction at once, a slow and terrible tightening, wrapping around wheels and legs and support struts with the patient strength of something that had been growing for centuries and had never once been in a hurry. A supply truck parked near the tree line sank into ground that had been solid an hour earlier, swallowed to its axles before the driver even managed to get the door open. Overhead, without a single cloud in the sky that morning, a creek 2 kilometers upstream suddenly changed course, sending a wall of water down through the corridor and turning the whole worksite into a churning brown flood within minutes. Nobody died. That detail would matter later, when the company tried to file a report calling the incident an unprovoked attack. Every worker made it out, soaked, terrified, and missing most of their equipment, but alive. The machines were not so lucky. By nightfall, the corridor site was a graveyard of half-sunken, root-wrapped metal, the forest's message delivered without a single life lost, and without the slightest room for argument. The surveyor, standing knee-deep in mud that had not existed that morning, radioed his superiors to say the project was cancelled, in a voice that had lost every trace of its earlier confidence. Silo walked the ruined worksite the next day with Nima and a handful of stunned colonists, careful to stay well back from the true tree line, even now. It was Nima who first noticed the detail that made her stop walking entirely. She pointed east, toward the small clearing barely a kilometer away where Daniel's cabin stood exactly as it always had, roof intact, garden untouched, not so much as a fallen leaf out of place. Sitting in perfect calm less than 1,000 paces from ground the forest had just torn apart without mercy. Sela stared at it for a long moment before saying, quietly, that whatever the forest had decided about that plot of land, it clearly did not apply to anyone else. The colony stopped laughing after that day. The betting pool at the trading post quietly closed, and Bran took the board down himself without anyone asking him to. In its place, a new and much more serious question began moving through Vera Hollow, whispered in the market and argued over in the administrator's office alike. It was no longer a question about luck or superstition or how long the human newcomer might survive. It was a question about what exactly the Deep Green had decided Daniel Reyes was, and why. Out of everyone who had ever stood at its border, it had chosen to treat him like something other than an intruder. The old records room beneath the colony archive had not been opened in years, and Nima had to argue with 3 different clerks before one of them finally agreed to unlock it for her. She was not looking for anything specific at first, only answers, and the deeper she dug through crumbling data crystals and half-translated survey logs left behind by the very first Rel settlers on Vera Hollow, the more she began to understand that nobody currently alive actually remembered the true history of the Deep Green. They only remembered being afraid of it. The oldest records told a different story. Long before the current colonies existed, before the buffer strips and the warnings and the betting pools at the trading post, an earlier group of Rel settlers had lived alongside the forest, not at war with it. Their logs described a set of habits, almost a code, followed by every member of that first generation. They never took wood without marking the tree first and waiting a full day before cutting, as though giving something the chance to object. They never hunted more than a household could eat in a week. They left offerings of water at the tree line during dry seasons, not out of superstition exactly, but out of the plain, practical belief that a living thing that gives you shelter deserves something back. The records called these settlers by an old word that did not translate cleanly into the modern Rel language, but the closest meaning Nima could piece together was something like kin of the green, or perhaps more simply, the ones who ask. That generation had lasted almost 60 years in peace before their descendants, hungrier for faster growth and larger harvests, abandoned the old habits one by one. The last entry in that section of the archive, written in a shaking hand, described the forest's response to the first large-scale clear-cutting attempt. It did not describe violence in detail. It only said that the trees stopped listening, and the ones who broke the old code were never seen again. After that entry, the records simply stopped, and the buffer strip policy began, passed down as fear without anyone left who remembered the reason behind it. Nima brought everything she had found to Daniel's cabin that evening, spreading the translated fragments across his porch table while he listened, still and quiet, the way he listened to most things. When she finished, she asked him directly whether he had known any of this before he built his home on the one plot the forest was supposed to reject. He told her he had not known a single word of it. He said the habits she was describing, marking a tree and waiting before cutting it, never taking more than he needed, leaving something behind for whatever else lived nearby, were not things he had learned on Vera Hollow at all. They were simply how he had been trained to work, decades ago and worlds away, clearing brush and managing wildfires in forests that could turn deadly the moment you stopped respecting them. He explained it plainly, without any sense that he was saying something extraordinary. On his own world, long before space travel brought him anywhere near Vera Hollow, he had spent years working in wild forest country prone to fire, learning early that the land did not forgive carelessness and did not care how confident you felt walking into it. The people who survived those forests longest were never the strongest or the best equipped. They were the ones who moved slowly, who paid attention, who treated every tree and every water source like it belonged to someone even when no one else was around to see them do it. He had carried those habits with him without ever thinking of them as a code or a ritual. To him, they were simply the difference between living carefully and living carelessly. Nima sat with that answer for a long while before speaking again. She told him that the old records described the very same behavior, word for word in spirit if not in language, as the exact code the forest had once recognized and rewarded generations ago, long before her own people had forgotten how to keep it. It was not that Daniel had been chosen by the Deep Green for any special reason, or that he carried some hidden power the forest responded to. It was simpler and, in its own way, far stranger than that. He was the first person to arrive at its border in longer than anyone could remember who had never stopped behaving like a guest, because nobody had ever taught him to behave any other way. The realization changed nothing about how Daniel lived his days. He still walked the tree line every evening. He still asked before he cut. He still left the fallen timber he did not need to rot back into the soil instead of hauling it away for profit. But it changed everything about how the colony understood him. Sela, when Nima brought her the same records the next morning, read through them twice in silence before admitting out loud what she had quietly suspected since the floods swallowed the survey company's machines. The forest had not made an exception for Daniel Reyes. It had simply remembered, through him, what an old and broken promise used to look like, and it was waiting to see whether anyone else on Vera Hollow still remembered how to keep it. The company did not accept its loss quietly. 3 weeks after the flooded corridor site was abandoned, a new fleet of transport ships dropped out of orbit above Vera Hollow, larger and better armed than anything the colony had seen before. This time the surveyor with the confident suit was not in charge. In his place stood a security contractor named for nothing more than her rank and her reputation, and she made it clear within her first broadcast to the colony that her orders had nothing to do with careful negotiation. Her company had lost an enormous sum of money to what their reports called an unexplained hostile environment, and she intended to burn a path through that environment by any means necessary, insurance claims, and old superstitions be damned. Sela called an emergency gathering the same night the ships landed, and for the first time since Daniel's arrival, the entire colony crowded into one hall to listen. The plan the security contractor had filed with the local port authority was not a narrow corridor this time. It called for controlled burns along 3 separate points of the tree line simultaneously, wide enough to strip away the forest's ability to respond the way it had before, and one of those 3 points sat close enough to the colony's outer buildings that a fire left uncontained could reach homes within the hour. Sela did not sugarcoat the danger when she spoke. She told the gathered colonists plainly that whatever the forest could do to protect itself, it had never had to defend anything but its own borders before, and nobody knew if it could, or would, extend that protection to the people living just outside them. Daniel sat near the back of the hall through the entire meeting and said nothing until Nima, sitting beside him, finally turned and asked him directly what he intended to do. He told her the truth, which was that he did not know if the forest would listen to him any differently now than it always had. He had never asked it for anything beyond permission to live quietly at its edge. He had never tested whether the trust it seemed to place in him extended any further than his own small plot of land. But he also told her that he did not intend to sit inside his cabin and wait to find out secondhand whether the colony survived the night. The burns began at dawn, 3 separate fires set along the tree line exactly as planned, fed by accelerant sprayed from low-flying drones designed to outpace anything the forest could grow to stop them. For the first time since anyone in the colony could remember, the deep green seemed to hesitate. The fires spread faster than the roots and vines could react, and for a long, terrible hour it looked as though the ancient forest, patient and powerful against slow-moving machines and greedy hands, simply had no answer for flame moving that quickly across dry ground. Daniel walked out to meet the closest burn line alone, against Sela's shouted objections, carrying nothing but a water skin and the same slow, careful pace he had used every evening since the day he arrived. He did not run toward the fire. He walked the tree line the way he always had, speaking quietly to the trees still standing untouched ahead of the flames, asking, the way he always asked, for whatever the forest could still give. Nemo watched from a safe distance, certain she was about to watch him disappear into smoke, and instead saw something she would spend the rest of her life trying to properly describe to anyone who had not been there themselves. The ground answered first, a low tremor spreading outward from where Daniel stood, and then the response came all at once, decades of stored strength unleashed in a single coordinated motion. Roots tore upward to smother the burn lines from beneath. Ancient trees, far too large to have grown in mere years, bent and dropped entire canopies of green, moisture-heavy branches directly onto the flames, choking them out faster than the accelerant could spread. Where the fire reached closest to the colony's edge, a wall of packed earth rose from the ground itself, crude and fast, and utterly effective, stopping the burn dead less than 100 meters from the nearest homes. The drones spraying fuel were plucked from the air entirely, yanked down by vines that seemed to move faster than the eye could track, and crushed silently in the dark beneath the canopy. It was over within 20 minutes. The security contractors' forces, watching their equipment and their carefully planned operation collapse in real time, pulled back without waiting for further orders, and by midday the last of their ships had lifted off Vera Hollow entirely. Their contract quietly and permanently revoked by an off-world authority that had no interest in explaining a total operational failure to its shareholders. The colony was left standing, singed at the edges but whole, and every single person who had gathered in that hall the night before now understood something they could not have explained a season earlier. The forest had not defended itself that day. It had defended them because Daniel had walked into the fire asking on their behalf. The same simple, careful request he had made 1,000 times before for himself, and for the first time, the deep green had chosen to answer for more than just one small cabin at its edge. Spring came to Vera Hollow the way it always had, slow and unremarkable, except for one detail that took the colony almost a week to notice properly. Along the old buffer strip, the wide dead ground that had separated every rel building from the true tree line for as long as the colony had existed, small green shoots had begun pushing up through soil that had been bare and lifeless since before Sela was born. Nobody had planted them. They simply appeared, spaced in careful, deliberate rows, far too even to be the work of wind or wandering seed. Nemo was the one who identified them first, kneeling in the dirt with a magnifying lens borrowed from the archive, comparing the young leaves against fragments of old botanical records nobody had needed in decades. They were saplings of the same ancient tree species that made up the oldest, deepest heart of the deep green, the kind that normally took a century or more to establish even a single new seedling near the forest's edge. Here they were sprouting in a matter of days, dozens of them, marching in an unmistakable line straight toward the colony's outer buildings instead of away from them. Word spread through Vera Hollow faster than it had for either the flood or the fire. But this time there was no fear behind it, only a kind of stunned, careful hope that nobody quite knew how to hold on to yet. Bran Keswick walked the new tree line every morning that week, no longer looking for an excuse to laugh, counting the saplings out loud to anyone who would listen, as though putting a number on them might make the whole thing feel more real. He stopped keeping count around 40 and simply stood there instead, staring at rows of young trees that seemed, by every measure anyone could think to apply, to be reaching toward the colony rather than reclaiming ground from it. Sela called for a formal gathering at the new tree line itself, something that would have been unthinkable only a season earlier, when standing this close to the buffer strip without urgent reason was considered a foolish risk. She brought Daniel with her, along with Nema and a handful of the colony's oldest residents, and together they walked the young rows in silence for a long while before anyone spoke. It was Sela who finally said out loud what everyone standing there was already beginning to understand. The deep green was not simply tolerating the colony's presence anymore, the way it had grudgingly tolerated Daniel's small cabin for months. It was asking to come closer. Nema pulled out the old translated records once more, the same fragments that had first explained the ancient code of the kin of the green, and found a passage she had passed over too quickly the first time. It described, in the careful, aging handwriting of that long-lost first generation, a final stage of the old relationship between the forest and its neighbors, one that had never been reached again after that generation's descendants broke the code and lost the forest's trust. The passage called it the turning of the border, the point at which the forest itself began to extend its reach toward a settlement, not out of aggression, but as an offer, planting itself where it judged its presence would be welcomed rather than feared. No living rel had ever witnessed it. Until now, most had assumed it was nothing more than a hopeful myth invented by a generation desperate to believe the peace they had built might someday be forgiven. Daniel listened to all of this the way he listened to most things, quietly and without any need to make himself the center of the moment. When Sela finally turned to ask him what he thought they should do, faced with an offer none of them had any real experience accepting, he only shrugged and said the same thing he had said to her on his very first day on Vera Hollow, months earlier, when she had warned him that nobody survived building this close to the trees. He said the forest had never asked anything from him except to be treated like it mattered. He saw no reason the colony could not offer it the same simple courtesy in return. It was a strange kind of ceremony that followed in the weeks after, one nobody had a name for, and everyone still remembered years later. The colony did not clear the new saplings, and did not build over them. Instead, they built around them, Homes and paths reshaped to leave the young trees standing exactly where they had chosen to grow, a colony and a forest slowly folding into each other's edges for the first time since anyone could remember either side wanting it that way. Daniel's own cabin no longer stood alone at the border. It stood, instead, at the beginning of something wider, the first small stitch in a seam the deep green itself had decided to sew shut. On the evening the last of the new saplings took proper root, Daniel walked the tree line one more time. The same slow, careful pace he had used every single day since his first afternoon on Vera Hollow, when a whole colony had laughed at the idea of a human building his home at the edge of a forest that killed anyone careless enough to come near it. He stopped in front of the youngest sapling, barely taller than his knee, and did the only thing he had ever known to do at that border. He nodded to it, quiet and unhurried. The same small courtesy he had shown the forest on the very first day now returned to him, 100 times over, in the shape of an entire tree line finally, choosing to lean back toward the people who had learned, at last, how to ask.